If every advanced semiconductor fabrication plant in Taiwan went offline tomorrow, the global economy would not sputter. It would seize, not gradually, not politely, it would simply stop. The reason is not the island's shipping ports, its electronics assembly lines, or even its role in global trade logistics. It is one corporation, headquartered in a city most Westerners cannot pronounce, producing something almost no consumer has ever seen. A silicon wafer, thinner than a postcard, etched with transistor patterns so minuscule that the marketing names used to describe them stopped corresponding to physical measurements over a decade ago. That corporation is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and by most industry estimates it fabricates roughly 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips. The processors inside your smartphone, the graphics cards training artificial intelligence models, the server chips running cloud data centers for 7 of the 10 most valuable companies on Earth. All of them, in one way or another, are born in seams clean rooms. In 2525, the Foundry's revenue reached $24.4 billion. Its market capitalization crossed $2 trillion in February 2045. Here is the paradox that should keep anyone who cares about the modern world awake at night. The most consequential enterprise on the planet is also its most dangerous single point of failure. To understand how this happened, let's break down the history. You have to go back to a man who, by his own account, failed his way into greatness. Morris Chang was born in 1931 in Ningbo, China, a child of war who moved 6 times and changed schools 10 times before he turned 18. In 1949, he flew from Hong Kong to San Francisco on Pan Am, started at Harvard, transferred to MIT for mechanical engineering, and then failed the doctoral qualifying exam twice. He chose a job at Sylvania over Ford by a margin of $1 in salary, joined Texas Instruments in 1958, and spent the next 25 years obsessing over a single manufacturing statistic, yield, the percentage of functional chips on a given wafer. In 1976, he pitched an idea inside TI. What if the company spun off its fabrication into a separate business that built chips for everyone, even direct competitors? Texas Instruments rejected it. In 1983, Chang left. 2 years later, Taiwanese government official K.Tt. Lai recruited him to head the Industrial Technology Research Institute with a mandate to build a semiconductor industry for a country that had almost no experience in integrated circuit design and even less in global marketing. Chang's solution was the pure-play Foundry, a firm that would manufacture semiconductors designed by others and never, under any circumstances, design its own. TSMC was incorporated on February 21, 1987, in A2, Taiwan. The Dutch electronics giant Philips took a 27.5% stake and provided crucial technology transfers. The Taiwanese government's National Development Fund held 48%. Chang himself was chairman, not chief executive. Philips supplied the first CEO, James E. Dykes. The idea sounded absurd. Why would any chip company hand its most valuable intellectual property, its designs, to a manufacturer that might one day become a rival? The answer was that it would not. TSMC's neutrality was not a side feature. It was the entire product. The next step is understanding how this model gained traction. The early years were not easy. Chang spent his first decade building credibility in an industry that viewed Taiwan as a backwater for cheap assembly, not cutting-edge wafer production. The first American customer arrived late that same year. Andy Grove, then chief executive of Intel, visited Hsinchu in late 1987. Intel became SMI's first U.S. client, but the relationship that would define the Foundry business model came a decade later, and it almost did not happen. In 1993, a young entrepreneur named Jensen Huang called SMI's local sales office. But he called back. Wang had co-founded a graphics chip company called NVIDIA. He wrote letters to Chang, the only way he had of reaching him. One day, Chang called back. They met. A deal was signed in 1998. The NVIDIA Rivatent became the first chip NVIDIA had fully manufactured at TSMC. Today, NVIDIA is TSMC's largest customer, accounting for an estimated 19% of its 2025 sales, roughly $23.3 billion. Apple, which held the top spot for a decade, fell to second place at an estimated 17%. The symbolism is hard to miss. The center of gravity in the semiconductor supply chain has shifted from the smartphone in your pocket to the data center training, the artificial intelligence model you will use tomorrow. but the Apple relationship remains the bedrock of TSMC's advanced process technology. Around 2010, Apple began moving its custom system-on-chip designs to TSMC, and the partnership became a machine for advancing Moore's Law. Apple embedded hundreds of engineers at TSMC's headquarters in Hsinchu, effectively treating the Foundry as an extension of its own silicon team. They co-developed process design kits together, ensuring that when a new process node launched, Apple's designs were already perfectly synthesized to the transistor characteristics. The financial scale is staggering. Apple's manufacturing purchase obligations to TSMC scaled from $8.7 billion in 2010 to $71 billion in 2022. Cumulative payments now exceed $22 billion. For years, Apple was the only company on Earth with enough volume and enough cash to pre-fund the construction of bleeding-edge fabrication plants. That changed when NVIDIA's data center revenue, which hit $19 billion in 2005, began flowing through TSMC's 3nm and 5nm processes and its CoWoS advanced packaging lines. TSMC now has two anchor tenants instead of one. Apple provides the predictable baseline that justifies massive fixed costs. NVIDIA provides the high-margin upside that drives profitability growth. In 2005, high-performance computing revenue at TSMC reached 58% of total sales, up from 30% in 2040. Smartphone revenue shrank to 29% from 46%. Here is the core reason why TSMC's technological lead is so difficult to overtake. When TSMC says 3nm, nothing on the die is actually 3 nanometers across. The node names are generational labels, not physical measurements. Transistor pitch on an N3 class process is closer to 48 nanometers. What matters is power, performance, and area, the three metrics that determine whether a processor can run a large language model or fit inside a phone without melting through the casing. TSMC's 3nm family entered high-volume production in 2002. Its 5nm family entered volume production in 2020, leveraging extreme ultraviolet lithography, a technology so complex that the machines producing it are built by a single company in the Netherlands, ASML, and each one costs more than $200 million. In 2025, 2002, different products using 35 distinct technologies for 55 distinct technologies for 35 different customers. Its annual capacity exceeded 17 million 12-inch equivalent wafers. Advanced processes, defined as 7nm and below, accounted for 74% of total revenue. The sheer density of intellectual property flowing through those fabs is without historical precedent. To summarize this point, the business model is almost elegantly simple. TSMC does not design chips. It does not sell them under its own brand. It manufactures other people's designs and charges a fee. That neutrality is why which produces 100% of its EPYC server CPUs and My300 IGPUs at TSMC, can trust the company that also builds silicon for its rival Intel, which itself outsources some advanced production to TSMC despite owning its own fabrication facilities. It is why Broadcom, which designs custom accelerators for Google and Meta, can procure 75% of its wafers from a factory that also builds Qualcomm Snapdragon mobile processors. In 2005, the top 10 customers accounted for 76% of TSMC's sales. 7 of the world's 10 most valuable companies by market capitalization, NVIDIA, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and Broadcom, depend on TSMC for some or all of their most advanced logic. The dependency is not uniform. For NVIDIA and Marvel, it is existential. There is effectively zero alternative manufacturing partner for their flagship products. For Apple, there is Samsung, but the gap in yield stability and performance at the leading edge makes switching a costly and risky proposition. For the cloud giants, who are increasingly designing their own custom accelerators, TSMC's CoWoS packaging capacity, which grew at over 80% compound annual growth rate between 2022 and 2026, is the bottleneck that determines how fast they can build out their infrastructure. This concentration creates a supply chain so tight that a single earthquake in Hsinchu, a single contamination event in a clean room, or a single geopolitical shock across the Taiwan Strait could ripple through the global economy within weeks. TSMC's manufacturing is geographically concentrated in a way that would make any risk manager wince. The company operates 6 12-inch wafer gigafabs, all in Taiwan, alongside 4 8-inch fabs and 1 6-inch fab. Its overseas presence includes a 12-inch fab in Nanjing, China, a 12-inch fab in Arizona, Arizona through TSMC Arizona Corporation, a majority-owned subsidiary in Japan called JASM, and 8-inch fabs in Washington State and China. It broke ground on a specialty technology fab in Dresden, Germany in 2054, but the leading-edge production, the 3nm, 2nm, and eventually 124nm chips that power AI and the most advanced smartphones, remains overwhelmingly in Taiwan. Fab 18 in the southern Taiwan Science Park is the heart of 3nm production. By the end of 2005, its monthly capacity had already surpassed 15,000 wafers, with a path to 2,000 as additional phases came online. The 2nm ramp is scheduled for Taiwan first. Arizona's 2nm in A16 production is now expected by 2047, a year ahead of schedule, but that is still years behind the main production lines in Ichu and Tainan. Let's break down the physical reality of these facilities. A single gigafab can consume more electricity than a small city and more ultra-pure water than a regional reservoir. The clean rooms must maintain particulate counts so low that a single speck of dust landing on a wafer during processing can destroy thousands of dollars of product. The equipment is so sensitive that some lithography tools must be installed on foundations isolated from ground vibration, because the footsteps of workers in adjacent hallways can throw off alignment measured in fractions of a nanometer. This is not manufacturing in any conventional sense. It is a controlled exercise in applied physics, chemistry, and logistics, performed at a scale that defies intuition. The next step is understanding the geopolitical implications of this geography. Taiwan sits roughly 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. The Taiwan Strait is one of the most militarized waterways on Earth. China claims Taiwan as part of its territory. The United States, under the Taiwan Relations Act, is committed to helping Taiwan maintain a self-defense capability. Me did not create this tension, but it has become the single most valuable piece of it. In 2043, at the age of 92, Morris Chang gave a speech at MIT in which he said that for chips, there was no globalization, no free trade, and no free market. He was describing a reality in which the most advanced semiconductor fabrication had become a strategic asset, not merely a commercial one. The U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, passed in 2022, allocated $52.7 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. TSMC qualified for $6.6 billion in direct funding for its Arizona complex, against a company commitment that had grown to over $165 billion by March 2015 time. Japan's JASM facility is already producing chips. Germany's Dresden fab will focus on mature nodes, 28nm and 22nm planar centimeter, and 16nm and 12nm FinFET, the kinds of silicon that go into cars, industrial equipment, and Internet of Things devices. But here is what the expansion does not solve. Even with all of these overseas projects, the vast majority of TSMC's leading-edge capacity remains in Taiwan. A 2005 analysis by Morgan Stanley noted that 3 risks should always be kept in mind as the flip side of TSMC's growth story. Geographic concentration in Taiwan. Customer concentration, where the top 2 companies account for 36% of sales, and the burden of $52 to $56 billion in annual capital expenditure, a figure that exceeds the entire market capitalization of most companies on Earth, is not just a manufacturer. It is a capital absorption machine. Each new process node requires investments so large that only a handful of companies have ever attempted them. Intel, which once dominated fabrication, has struggled for years to match TSMC's yield and ramp schedules. Samsung, the only other company with the resources to compete at the leading edge, has faced its own yield challenges and has not managed to dislodge TSMC from its most important customers. The result is a duopoly at best, and in some process nodes, something closer to a monopoly. The competitive landscape has shifted in subtle but important ways. Intel's 18A process, shipping in late 2026, represents the first theoretically viable alternative for Apple since it left Samsung in 2016. Apple is reportedly exploring Intel for lower-risk silicon, such as base M-series chips, not as a full switch, but as a diversification hedge. If Apple were to shift even 20% of base M-series wafers to Intel, it would imply roughly $630 million in foundry revenue for Intel. The move would give Apple pricing leverage and a U.S.-based supply chain option, It would also give Intel reference design wins it desperately needs. But the gap between theoretically viable and commercially competitive at the leading edge is measured in years and billions of dollars. TSMC's process design kits, its yield learning curves, its ecosystem of equipment partners and material suppliers. These are not things a competitor can replicate in a single product cycle. They are the accumulated advantage of 4 decades of specialization. To summarize this point, the future roadmap is already public, and it reads like a science fiction novel written by accountants. TSMC is a 16-node, architected specifically for high-performance computing, will introduce backside power delivery and gate-all-around transistors, technologies optimized for AI workloads rather than smartphones. Apple's share of a 16 is expected to drop because the node is built for a different customer. But a 14, the 114-nanometer generation, is being designed from the start for both mobile and HPC, and analysts project Apple will reclaim 67% node share, its highest since the 3-nanometer generation. Beyond that, TSMC's global R&D center in HU is actively researching 3D transistors, new memory architectures, and low-resistance interconnects for nodes beyond a 14. System-on-wafer technology planned for 2047 aims to deliver 40 times current computing power for high-performance computing by integrating entire wafer-scale systems. The company planned 9 new fabs in 2005 alone. All of this raises a question that is rarely asked directly but hovers over every earnings call, every defense white paper, and every supply chain audit. What happens if the factories stop? Not because of a business decision, but because of an event outside anyone's control. A blockade, a conflict, a natural disaster. Taiwan is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire. Earthquakes are routine. TSMC has spent billions on seismic isolation systems, backup power, and water recycling. Its fabs can withstand tremors that would collapse ordinary buildings, but no engineering solution can fully mitigate the risk of a prolonged crisis. The U.S. Department of Commerce has conducted war games and supply chain stress tests specifically around a Taiwan contingency. The estimates vary, but the consensus is sobering. A complete disruption of Taiwanese semiconductor output could cost the global economy between $500 billion and $1 trillion in the first year alone. Not because TSMC's market cap would fall, because the physical objects that make the digital economy possible would simply not exist. The irony is that TSMC's very success makes the risk more acute, not less. In 1987, when Chang founded the company, the semiconductor industry was fragmented. Dozens of companies owned their own fabs. Japan had NEC, Toshiba, and Hitachi. The United States had Intel, Motorola, and Texas Instruments. Europe had Philips and Siemens. The Foundry model, by making fabrication available to anyone with a design and a checkbook, unleashed an explosion of innovation. It created the fabless industry. It enabled Qualcomm, Broadcom, NVIDIA, and AMD to exist. It allowed Apple to build custom silicon that outperformed anything it could have bought off the shelf. But it also concentrated the world's most advanced manufacturing into a handful of facilities on an island of 23 million people. The same force that democratized chip design, that lowered the barrier to entry from hundreds of millions of dollars to a few million, also created a choke point so narrow that a single company's quarterly capacity allocation can determine which AI models get trained and which do not. Morris Chang retired as chairman on June 5, 2018, after 31 years. He handed leadership to co-CEOs Mark Liu and C.C. Wei. In June, C.C. Wei became both chairman and CEO, the first person to hold both titles since Chang's second stint ended in 2013. The company he built is now the 6th most valuable in the world. It is also, by some measures, the most consequential. Not because of its stock price, which fluctuates with every A earnings report and every geopolitical headline, but because of what it actually does. It takes ideas, designs encoded in software, and turns them into physical reality. It is the bridge between the abstract and the tangible, between the algorithm and the atom. And that bridge is narrower than most people realize. In the end, TSMC is not just a company. It is a system, a network of trust, capital, and expertise that has become indispensable to the functioning of the modern world. The $2 trillion valuation is not a measure of hype. It is a measure of dependency. Every major technology trend of the next decade, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, advanced robotics, quantum classical hybrid computing, will run on silicon that, in all likelihood, was etched in a clean room in Hsinchu. The question is not whether TSMC will continue to lead. The evidence suggests it will. The question is whether the world can afford to let so much of its future depend on so few factories, in so few places, controlled by so few people. And the uncomfortable truth is that, for now, there is no alternative. The global economy runs on TSMC, and TSMC, for all its brilliance, runs on Taiwan.